3 days of national mourning have been declared in Zimbabwe following the death of former President Robert Mugabe. The statesman died in a Singapore hospital yesterday. Mugabe's legacy has been the subject of much debate since he died. But to discuss this, we are joined by Africa analyst Kofi Kwaku via Skype. Kofi, thank you so much for your time. Let's discuss that particular theme, which is former President of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe's legacy. And perhaps let's try and dissect it per decade. Take me through your analysis from the first decade that he, of course, ruled in Zimbabwe to the last few years.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. First, I must say that I'm not an obituarist. I'm rather an observer and an analyst. And second, I'm also a scenario strategist. So I like to sort of look at the legacy, but also think about what we usually call the so what, or what's next for Zimbabwe. So my analysis will be having three layers. The first one is Mugabe the man. The second is Mugabe the institution. And then the third is Mugabe the African symbol. So throughout all these three layers, I'm going to try to see if I can sketch very quickly the legacy. First, Mugabe the man, the man of ideas, the man of ideals, and also the sort of British and also Jesuit educated person, big, tall, very smart. He even spoke better English than other people, could articulate, if you want, the challenges of liberation much better than anybody else. We remember how hard time he gave to Prime Minister Tony Blair way back. But most important, he stood really strong as a man of African descent, but at the same time, somebody who knew what he wanted, especially in the first 10 years of his life. But he was the product of a very brutal system, British system, that molded him in a way that, in fact, he managed to kill the system, and then he owned it. But by owning the system, he became the system, and he embodies, if you want, the brutal element of that system. So institutionally, that's exactly what he was doing. We remember, for example, how well he came out from 1980 when he was, the prime minister and also running the country with so much hope. Then with time, trying to bring about the changes necessary to free his country, he realized that, in fact, it was so difficult, it had become an institution that he couldn't get rid of. So he became what he killed, but at the same time, he couldn't try to get out of it. And that mainly became what I call the African symbol, which is mainly what we've seen across the African continent. Most of African leaders start well, they're meaning, they have a good way of looking at liberation, and then they transform into some kind of brutal beast in the end. And then so what basically he found and founded really is in tatters today.
And Kofi, I mean, we've seen different countries and global leaders, of course, discussing and commenting on his passing. The West, for example, hailing him as a villain. This we've seen in the UK, as well as the US comments. But African leaders, Chinese President and Russian President Vladimir Putin, hailing him as a hero. But I think at the essence of this is, Zimbabwean citizens. What is their memory of former President Robert Mugabe?
Yes, I could even say that it's very well put. It's very difficult for most of us to sort of see him with one lens. I would say we can't even see him with a binary lens. It's got to be trilateral or even more. But the first two that come out is people will be against him, others won't be, will like him as well. But there's always in between. There's a man of incredible power, incredible influence, but also incredible presence. There's no way we can forget that. The West will paint him, and he's a product of the West, in fact, of colonialism. So it's not easy to get rid of that. And the West didn't like him because he didn't probably play that game. The struggle to have a stooge in Mugabe, and they didn't get it exactly as they wanted him. So the legacy there will be very sketchy. And then people who saw him as somebody who was a liberator, somebody who was fighting against a force of oppression, of brutality. British colonialism was brutal, dangerous. Millions of people died out of it. So really, for somebody like that, who managed to really survive, he was resilient. He was a survivor. It was a struggle man. He managed to sort of live and die, of course, in a foreign hospital. He could have died in his own hospital, but this is the irony of it. So this is a very sketchy, I wouldn't say, I know many people talk about a complex picture, but I would say a diversified picture, and that's the truth of the man who died. So I would also say, so what? The so what for me is what's next for Zimbabwe. I remember many years ago, I was doing some scenario exercises in Zimbabwe with a group of Zimbabwean, and I came up with a very, very uncomfortable scenario name called Tomorrow in Salisbury. Salisbury was the ancient name of the capital of what today is Harare. And it was, to me, it was a way to paint the irony, the contradiction of the future of Zimbabwe, which has a name of something that really doesn't resonate well. And I think this is where we are today. And Zimbabwe is still searching for itself, is struggling to get out of the mess it is in.
All right, Kofi Kwaku, thank you so much for your time. That was Africa Analyst Kofi Kwaku joining us via Skype, talking about the legacy that former Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe, who's now late, leaves behind.